Your mother brought nothing to the table. Nothing financial. Nothing strategic. Nothing of value. I built this company with my own 2 hands. The words hung in the air of the federal courtroom like smoke after a fire. Donovan Prescott adjusted his silk tie and leaned back in his chair, waiting for the judge to acknowledge what he clearly believed was self-evident truth. Across the aisle, Margaret Holbrook sat perfectly still. Her hands were folded in her lap. Her gray cardigan was simple, unadorned, the kind of garment a woman wears when she has stopped trying to impress anyone. She did not flinch at her husband's words. She did not cry. She did not even blink. She simply watched. In the gallery behind Donovan, a young woman in an expensive cream blazer nodded along with his testimony. Victoria Chen was 31 years old, polished, ambitious, and utterly convinced that she understood the man she had been sleeping with for the past 2 years. She did not. The judge, a silver-haired man named Harold Brennan, made a note on his legal pad. His face revealed nothing. Donovan continued, his voice carrying the practiced warmth of a man who had spent decades charming investors and board members. I know this is difficult to hear. I know Margaret believed she was contributing. But belief and reality are not the same thing. The reality is that Prescott Capital exists because of my vision, my sacrifice, my sleepless nights. She was present for the journey. But she was never part of the engine. Margaret's attorney, a young woman named Claire Oduya, shifted uncomfortably in her seat. She had taken this case believing there was more to the story than the press reported. Now, watching her client sit in absolute silence for the 3rd consecutive day, she was beginning to wonder if she had been wrong. Mrs. Prescott, Judge Brennan said, his voice neutral. Do you wish to respond to your husband's characterization? Margaret turned her head slowly, meeting the judge's eyes. For a moment, something flickered across her face. Not anger. Not pain. Something else entirely. Not yet, Your Honor, she said quietly. I am waiting. Waiting for what? The judge asked. Margaret did not answer. She simply returned her gaze to the great seal mounted on the wall behind the bench, and resumed her silence. In the gallery, Victoria leaned toward the woman beside her. She whispered just loud enough for the back rows to hear. She has nothing. It is almost sad, really. Like watching someone drown and refuse to swim. But Margaret Holbrook was not drowning. She was counting. She had been counting for 3 years, waiting for this exact moment, waiting for one specific question that would bring everything crashing down. Welcome back to another powerful story, my beloved listeners. Kindly tell where you're watching from and what time it is where you're at. If you're new here, prepare for a story of betrayal, unexpected love, and what truly makes a family. Drop everything and listen closely. This tale of heartbreak and redemption might just change how you view love and family forever. The mahogany paneling of Courtroom 14 seemed designed to intimidate. The ceilings rose high enough to make human beings feel small. The windows were narrow, admitting only thin shafts of November light that did nothing to warm the space. Donovan Prescott looked entirely at home here. At 62, he remained the picture of distinguished success. His silver hair was expertly styled. His charcoal suit cost more than most people earned in a month. His posture radiated the easy confidence of a man who had spent 3 decades being told he was brilliant. The financial press had covered this divorce with barely concealed anticipation. Prescott Capital was worth over $2 billion. The dissolution of a 25-year marriage to the woman who had been there from the beginning should have been dramatic, contentious, explosive. Instead, it had been remarkably one-sided. For 3 days, Margaret had sat in that straight-back chair while Donovan's legal team systematically dismantled her reputation. They brought forward household staff who described her as distant and emotionally unstable. They produced executives who claimed she had never attended strategy meetings. They painted a portrait of a woman who had spent a quarter-century riding her husband's coattails, contributing nothing but her presence. And through it all, Margaret said nothing. Claire Oduya had tried. She had objected when the testimony became obviously rehearsed. She had challenged the credibility of witnesses who were clearly still on Prescott's payroll. But she was one young attorney against Harrison Webb, a man the legal community called the surgeon for his ability to cut opponents apart without leaving visible wounds. The match was not fair. Everyone in the courtroom knew it. During a recess on the second day, Claire had pulled Margaret into a private conference room, her frustration barely contained. "You have to give me something to work with," Claire said. "The documents you provided, the incorporation papers, the analysis files, I do not understand how they fit together. And if I do not understand them, I cannot present them effectively." Margaret looked at her attorney with an expression that was almost gentle. "You will understand when the time comes." "When is the time going to come? They are destroying you out there. They are calling you incompetent, unstable, worthless. And you just sit there." "I am not just sitting there," Margaret said quietly. "I am waiting." "For what?" "For Judge Brennan to ask about the founding capital." Claire stared at her. The founding capital? That was 25 years ago. Why would he ask about that? "Because he is thorough," Margaret said. "I researched him extensively before we came to court. He was widowed young, raised 3 daughters alone. He has spent 40 years watching powerful men lie in his courtroom, and he has developed an instinct for when something does not add up." Claire shook her head. "And if he does not ask?" "He will." "But how can you be certain?" Margaret's eyes held something Claire had not seen before. A depth of patience that seemed almost inhuman. A certainty that went beyond hope. "Because I have been certain of very little in my life," Margaret said. "But I am certain of this. The question will come. And when it does, everything changes." Claire wanted to argue. She wanted to demand more information, more strategy, more control over a case that seemed to be slipping away. But something in Margaret's stillness stopped her. This was not a woman who had given up. This was a woman who was playing a game so long and so careful that no one else could see the board. The third day of proceedings began with Harrison Webb in peak form. He strutted before the bench like a man who knew exactly how the story would end, because he had written the ending himself. "Your Honor," Webb said, his voice rich with rehearsed sincerity, "we have established through extensive testimony that my client, Donovan Prescott, is solely responsible for the creation and success of Prescott Capital. The respondent, while present during the marriage, functioned in a purely domestic capacity. She has no claim to the company's value beyond what my client has generously offered." He paused for effect. $8,000 per month in maintenance, plus the residence in Greenwich. This is more than fair for a woman whose contributions were, frankly, negligible. In the gallery, someone snorted. Margaret did not need to look to know it was Victoria. Judge Brennan reviewed the documents before him. His expression remained carefully neutral, but Claire noticed that he had been taking more notes than usual. His pen moved steadily across his legal pad, capturing details that others might overlook. "Mr. Webb," the judge said, "I have reviewed the financial disclosures provided by your client. There are some inconsistencies I would like to address." Webb's smile flickered, just for a moment. "Of course, Your Honor. We are happy to clarify any questions." "The offshore accounts," Judge Brennan said. "The disclosures show minimal liquid assets, yet the company valuation suggests significant reserves. Where is the working capital housed?" "Various investment vehicles," Webb said smoothly. "My client can provide detailed accounting if the court requires." "I do require it," Judge Brennan said. "But that is not my primary concern at the moment." He turned to Donovan, who sat with practiced composure at the petitioner's table. "Mr. Prescott, the original incorporation documents for Prescott Capital show founding capital of $300,000. Can you describe the source of those funds?" Donovan nodded, his expression humble and earnest. The face of a man who had perfected the art of seeming trustworthy. "Personal savings, Your Honor. I had been working in consulting for several years before I started the company. I saved every penny I could. When the opportunity came, I invested everything I had." Judge Brennan made another note. "And there were no external investors at the founding? No inherited funds? No capital from any other source?" Donovan shook his head firmly. "I built this company from nothing, Your Honor. Every dollar, every decision, every sleepless night, it all came from me. My wife was supportive in the early years, of course. But financially, strategically, She brought nothing to the table. The words landed with the weight of absolute certainty. And that certainty would be his undoing. To understand what happened next, we must go back. 25 years back, to a different city, a different economy, a different Donovan Prescott entirely. Cleveland, Ohio, 1999. The winter had been brutal, and the economic forecast was not much better. The conference center downtown was hosting an event for struggling small business owners, a gathering of desperate entrepreneurs hoping to find investors, partners, anyone who might help them survive another quarter. Donovan Prescott was 37 years old and running out of time. His consulting firm had been limping along for 3 years, sustained by small contracts and smaller dreams. He had talent, certainly. He could walk into a room and make people believe in him. But talent without capital was just potential, and potential did not pay the rent. He had borrowed money from everyone who would lend it. He had pitched investors who smiled politely and never called back. He was 6 weeks away from closing the business entirely when he arrived at the Cleveland Economic Recovery Summit with a presentation he had practiced 100 times and a desperation he could no longer hide. Margaret Holbrook noticed him from across the room. She was 33 years old, working as an independent financial analyst after spending 5 years watching the corporate world from the inside. Her father had owned a small manufacturing company in Youngstown, a business that had been in the family for 2 generations before it was destroyed by a predatory acquisition. The investors had stripped it for parts, sold off the equipment, laid off workers who had given decades of their lives to the company. Her father had died of a heart attack 6 months later. The doctors called it natural causes. Margaret called it murder by spreadsheet. She had inherited his life insurance and his obsession with understanding how companies really worked. Not the glossy version presented in annual reports, but the hidden mechanics of value and vulnerability. She had developed a method for identifying companies that were undervalued, overlooked, ripe for transformation. And she had developed an instinct for recognizing people who did not know what they were doing. Donovan Prescott was clearly one of those people. She watched him pitch his consulting business to a group of investors, his charm working overtime to compensate for the weakness of his actual strategy. He was proposing expansion without any clear plan for execution. He was projecting revenues based on contracts he did not have. He was, in short, selling a dream to people who dealt in reality. The investors were polite. They shook his hand and promised to be in touch. They would not be in touch. Margaret approached him afterward, when he was standing alone by the coffee station, his confident facade cracking at the edges. "That pitch needs work," she said simply. Donovan turned to look at her. His first instinct was defensiveness. His second, when he actually saw her, was curiosity. She was not conventionally striking, but there was something in her eyes that suggested she saw more than most people. "Excuse me. Your projections are based on wishful thinking," Margaret said. "You are assuming a 40% close rate on proposals when your historical average is closer to 15. You are proposing to expand into markets you clearly have not researched. And you are asking for capital without explaining how you will actually deploy it." Donovan stared at her. No one had ever dissected his pitch so precisely. "I have been doing this for 3 years," he said, his voice tighter than he intended. "And in 3 years, how many of those investors have actually funded you?" The question landed like a slap. Donovan wanted to be angry, but something in her directness stopped him. She was not being cruel. She was being accurate. "None," he admitted finally. Margaret nodded. "That is what I thought." She pulled a business card from her pocket. "I am a financial analyst. I specialize in identifying undervalued opportunities and developing strategies for transformation. If you are interested in actually making your business work, call me." She walked away before he could respond. Donovan looked at the card in his hand. Margaret Holbrook, Financial Strategy Consultant. The address was a small office building on the east side of Cleveland, far from the gleaming towers of downtown. He almost threw the card away. His pride demanded it. But his desperation was stronger. He called her 3 days later. Their first meeting lasted 4 hours. Margaret arrived at his cramped office with a folder full of notes and a perspective that cut through everything he thought he knew about his own business. "You do not have a consulting firm," she told him. "You have a sales operation with no product. You sell your time, but you do not create lasting value. Every contract ends, and you have to start over. That is not a business. That is a treadmill. Donovan wanted to argue, but he could not. She was right. So what do I do? He asked. You pivot, she said. You stop selling consulting and start acquiring companies. I do not have the capital to acquire anything. Not yet. But I have been researching your client list. 3 of the companies you consulted for are undervalued and poorly managed. If you acquire them instead of just advising them, you could restructure their operations, improve their margins, and sell them at significant profit. Donovan leaned forward, suddenly interested. And where would I get the capital for that? Margaret paused. This was the moment she had been building toward. The moment that would change both of their lives. I have it, she said. He stared at her. You have $300,000 to invest in a company run by a man you met at a conference 3 days ago? I have done my research, Margaret said. On the companies you could acquire. On the markets they operate in. On you. You have flaws, certainly. But you also have something that cannot be taught. You make people believe in you. That is rare. She met his eyes directly. I lost my father's company because predatory investors saw vulnerability where they should have seen potential. I've spent 5 years learning how to see the difference. I see potential in you, Donovan. Real potential. But only if you are willing to learn. What would you need from me? Partnership, Margaret said. Real partnership. You handle the clients, the negotiations, the public face. I handle the analysis, the strategy, the actual mechanics of transformation. We split everything equally. Donovan considered this. His pride screamed at him to refuse. He was supposed to be the brilliant one, the visionary, the man who built empires. Taking instructions from a woman he barely knew felt like an admission of failure. But he was about to fail anyway. At least this way, he might fail with $300,000. Deal, he said. They shook hands. Neither of them knew it yet, but that handshake would create a billion-dollar empire. And 25 years later, only one of them would remember whose hands had actually built it. The first year of their partnership was electric. Margaret's analysis identified their first acquisition target, a struggling machine parts manufacturer in Toledo. The company was bleeding money under incompetent management, but its underlying assets were sound. Its customer base was loyal. Its workforce was skilled. All it needed was leadership. Donovan handled the negotiation, charming the desperate owners into selling at a price far below actual value. Margaret restructured the operations, identifying waste and inefficiency that the previous owners had been too close to see. Within 18 months, the company was profitable. They sold it for triple what they had paid. Their second acquisition was larger. A regional trucking company with valuable routes and outdated management. Margaret saw the potential. Donovan closed the deal. Together, they turned crisis into profit. By the 3rd year, they were married. It happened quietly, without much fanfare. Donovan proposed on a Tuesday evening, in the small apartment they had been sharing while they reinvested every dollar into growing the business. The ring was modest. The ceremony was simpler still, a courthouse wedding with 2 witnesses and a justice of the peace. But something in Margaret believed it was real. Something in the way Donovan looked at her when she explained a complex financial structure, when she identified an opportunity no one else could see. He seemed grateful. He seemed like a partner. I could not do this without you, he told her on their wedding night. You know that, right? None of this would exist without you. She believed him. She wanted to believe him. And for a while, belief was enough. They moved from Cleveland to Chicago to New York as the business grew. Prescott Capital, they called it, though the founding documents told a more complicated story. The capital had come from Margaret's trust, from her father's life insurance, from everything she had inherited after his death. She had structured the incorporation carefully, protecting her interests while giving Donovan the visible ownership he seemed to need. She did not resent the arrangement. She understood that the world they operated in responded to confidence, to charisma, to the particular brand of authority that Donovan projected. She was content to work in the background, to be the engine while he was the face. That was her first mistake. The change happened so gradually that Margaret almost did not notice it. In the early years, Donovan credited her constantly. In private meetings, in strategy sessions, in the quiet moments after a successful deal. "You saw this before anyone else," he would say. "I would never have found this opportunity without you." But as the company grew, as the press began to pay attention, as magazine profiles and conference invitations started arriving, something shifted. The first interview was with a business journal out of Chicago. They wanted to feature up-and-coming entrepreneurs who were changing the landscape of corporate acquisition. Donovan was thrilled. Margaret prepared him extensively, explaining the strategic rationale behind each deal so he could articulate it clearly. When the article came out, her name was not mentioned once. She told herself it was the journalist's choice, that the narrative of the lone visionary was simply more compelling than the truth of partnership. Donovan had probably explained her contributions, and the writer had edited them out. But the second article was the same, and the third, and the 10th. By the time Rachel was born in 2002, Margaret had stopped expecting credit. She had been quietly removed from the public narrative of Prescott Capital so completely that most people did not know she existed. She retreated into motherhood, telling herself it was a choice. Rachel needed her. The company was successful enough that Margaret could step back from the day-to-day operations. She would still do the analysis from home, still identify the acquisition targets and develop the restructuring strategies. But she would do it in the background, where she had always been most comfortable. That was her second mistake. The documents kept coming. Donovan would send her files on potential targets, and she would send back detailed assessments. Her handwriting filled the margins of financial reports. Her analysis underpinned every major decision. But the cover memos that went to the board, the presentations that went to investors, the public announcements that went to the press, those all bore Donovan's name alone. She started keeping copies. Not suspiciously, she told herself. Just for her records. Just in case anyone ever asked about the strategic rationale behind a particular deal. No one ever asked. Rachel grew up watching her mother work. Even as a child, she understood that something was wrong. She would see Margaret hunched over documents late at night, making notes and calculations while Donovan was out at dinners and galas and conferences. She would hear her father on television, taking credit for insights that Rachel knew came from her mother. "Why does Daddy never say thank you?" Rachel asked once, when she was 8 years old. Margaret looked at her daughter, and for a moment, something cracked in her composure. "Some people forget where their success comes from," she said finally. "That does not mean the success is any less real." It was not an answer. Both of them knew it. By the time Rachel was 15, Prescott Capital was worth $800 million. Donovan's face had appeared on the cover of Forbes. His name was mentioned alongside the great corporate raiders of the era. He gave speeches about vision and risk-taking and the courage to see what others could not. He never mentioned Margaret. Worse, he began to believe his own mythology. The story he told the public became the story he told himself. In his mind, he really was the visionary, the genius, the man who had built an empire from nothing through sheer force of will. Margaret watched this transformation with growing unease. The man who had once been grateful for her partnership now dismissed her input with barely concealed contempt. "You are not in the trenches anymore," he told her when she questioned a potential acquisition. "You have been out of the game too long. Trust me on this." She still sent her analysis. He stopped reading it. She still identified risks. He stopped listening. She still loved him. But she had begun to fear him. Victoria Chen arrived in 2021. She was 29 years old, fresh from a prestigious graduate program, ambitious and attentive in exactly the way that Donovan craved. He hired her as a junior analyst. Within 6 months, she was his special assistant. Within a year, she was something more. Margaret noticed the signs. The late nights at the office that stretched later and later. The phone calls taken in other rooms. The sudden interest in his appearance, in his fitness, in seeming younger than his 60 years. She did not confront him. That was not her way. Instead, she began to prepare. She retrieved her old security credentials and updated the home system, adding cameras and backup drives that Donovan did not know existed. She started making copies of everything, not just her own analysis, but financial records, communication logs, anything that documented the truth of their partnership. And she began to research the original incorporation documents she had drafted 25 years earlier, looking for something she had almost forgotten. What she found made her catch her breath. In her haste to protect her investment while still allowing Donovan the visible control he needed, she had structured the founding capital through a trust. The Holbrook Family Trust, funded by her father's life insurance, had provided the $300,000 that created Prescott Capital. And that trust had never been dissolved. Donovan had signed amendments over the years, restructuring ownership and issuing shares and creating the complex web of holdings that now constituted his empire. But he had never addressed the original trust. He had never amended the founding documents. Because he had forgotten they existed. Because he had forgotten where the money came from. He had told the story of building something from nothing so many times that he believed it. The mythology had replaced the memory. Margaret sat alone in her home office, staring at the documents, understanding what they meant. She owned more of Prescott Capital than anyone knew, including Donovan. The incident that ended the marriage occurred on a Thursday in October. Donovan had been drinking since he returned from a board meeting where someone had dared to question one of his decisions. He was not accustomed to being questioned. The experience had wounded his pride in ways that required a target. Rachel was home from Los Angeles, where she had been building a career as a documentary filmmaker. At 28, she had her mother's quiet intensity and her own fierce sense of justice. She had been working on a project about women whose contributions were erased from corporate history. She did not realize how personal that project would become. "I found something at an estate sale," Rachel told her father, holding up a small leather folder. "Some old correspondence that might be relevant to my documentary. Letters between a female executive and the CEO who took credit for her work." Donovan barely glanced at her. He was pouring his third bourbon of the evening, his movements sharp with agitation. "That sounds tedious," he said. "Who wants to watch a documentary about professional victims?" Rachel's jaw tightened. "They are not victims. They are women whose work was stolen, whose contributions were erased, whose names were removed from history." "History remembers the people who matter," Donovan said. "If they were erased, maybe there was a reason." Rachel looked at her mother, who sat quietly in the corner of the living room, her face carefully blank. "Like Mom?" Rachel asked softly. Donovan turned, his glass frozen halfway to his lips. "Excuse me? Mom's contributions to this company. Do they not matter? Should she be erased?" The silence that followed was heavy and dangerous. Donovan set down his glass with exaggerated care. He walked toward his daughter, his expression shifting from irritation to something colder. "Your mother," he said slowly, "answers phones. She files papers. She manages the household. That is her contribution. Everything else, the strategy, the vision, the actual building of this empire, that came from me." "That is not true," Rachel said, her voice rising. "I have seen her analysis files. I remember watching her work when I was a child. She was up every night, doing the research, identifying the targets." "You remember wrong." "I do not remember wrong, Dad. I have copies of documents in her handwriting, dated before the deals she was analyzing." Donovan's face contorted. "You have copies of what?" Rachel realized her mistake too late. She had not meant to reveal that she had been gathering evidence. She had not meant to show her hand. But she was her mother's daughter. She had learned that documentation mattered. "I have been helping Mom," Rachel said, forcing her voice to stay steady, "organizing her files. And there are decades of analysis, strategy, insights, all in her handwriting. All predating the deals that made you famous." Donovan stepped closer. His eyes had gone flat and cold in a way Rachel had never seen before. "Those files are company property," he said. "If you have removed them from this house, that is theft. They are Mom's work. She wrote them. They belong to her. Nothing belongs to her, Donovan snarled. She has nothing. She is nothing. This family exists because of me. This house exists because of me. Every dollar, every opportunity, every moment of comfort you have ever experienced came from my work, my sacrifice, my genius. He turned to Margaret, who had risen from her chair but remained silent. Tell her, Donovan demanded. Tell her the truth. Tell her that you contributed nothing. That you were lucky I kept you around as long as I did. Margaret looked at her husband, the man she had funded, trained, guided, and believed in for 25 years. The man who now stood in her living room, red-faced and furious, demanding that she deny her own existence. She said nothing. Her silence enraged him further. You see, Donovan shouted, turning back to Rachel. She cannot even defend herself, because there is nothing to defend. She is a glorified secretary who got above herself. Rachel stepped forward, putting herself between her father and her mother. I will not listen to this anymore, she said. I am leaving, and I am taking those files with me. What happened next would stay with Margaret forever. Donovan grabbed Rachel's arm, his grip hard enough to bruise. She tried to pull away. He yanked her closer. You are not taking anything, he hissed. You are just like her. Weak. Useless. You will never amount to anything on your own. Rachel wrenched her arm free, stumbling backward. Her eyes were bright with tears and fury. I am exactly like her, Rachel said, and that is the greatest compliment I have ever received. She left that night. She did not say goodbye to her father. She hugged her mother tightly, whispering something in her ear that made Margaret's expression flicker with something like hope. Then she was gone. Margaret stood in the silent living room, looking at the man she had married. He was already calming down, already rationalizing, already convincing himself that his outburst had been justified. She will come back, Donovan said, as if nothing had happened. They always do. Margaret did not respond. She walked quietly to her home office, closed the door, and sat down at her computer. She opened the security footage from the living room cameras. She watched the entire confrontation play out again on the screen. Donovan's words. Rachel's defiance. The moment when he grabbed their daughter hard enough to leave marks. She saved the file to 3 separate backup drives. Then she opened the folder containing 25 years of documentation. Every analysis she had written. Every strategy she had developed. Every acquisition she had identified. And the original incorporation papers that proved where the money had really come from. She knew now what she had to do. But she also knew that doing it wrong would destroy everything. Donovan had resources, connections, lawyers who would bury her in litigation for decades. She needed to wait for the right moment. The right question. The right opportunity to reveal the truth in a way that he could not spin or deny. 3 years later, that moment arrived. Day 3 of the divorce proceedings began with an air of inevitable conclusion. Harrison Webb delivered his closing arguments with the confidence of a man who had already written the headlines. Margaret sat in her gray cardigan, her hands folded, her expression empty. To the observers in the gallery, she looked like a woman who had accepted defeat. They could not have been more wrong. Judge Brennan reviewed the documents before him with characteristic thoroughness. He had been listening carefully throughout the 3 days of testimony, making notes, asking questions that the attorneys had not anticipated. He was not finished asking questions yet. Before I render my preliminary assessment, he said, I have one more matter to address. Webb and Donovan exchanged glances. This was not in the script. Mr. Prescott, you testified that the founding capital of your company came from personal savings. You stated that your wife brought nothing to the table financially. That is correct, Your Honor, Donovan said, his voice smooth and certain. And you are certain there were no external investors? No inherited funds? No capital from any other source? Donovan nodded firmly. I built this company from nothing. Every dollar came from my own hard work. Judge Brennan made a note. Then he looked at Margaret. Mrs. Prescott, he said, you have remained silent throughout these proceedings. Before I move forward, I want to give you the opportunity to respond to your husband's characterization. Is there anything you wish to say? Claire leaned toward Margaret urgently. This is it, she whispered. Whatever you have been waiting for, now is the time. Margaret sat very still for a moment. Then, slowly, she rose to her feet. The courtroom fell silent. Yes, Your Honor, Margaret said, and her voice was clear and steady and nothing like the broken woman they expected. There is something I wish to say. She turned to face Donovan directly. His expression was annoyed, impatient. He wanted this to be over. He had no idea what was coming. My husband has just committed perjury, Margaret said. The words landed like a bomb. Webb leaped to his feet, shouting objections. Donovan's face went pale. In the gallery, Victoria's mouth fell open. Judge Brennan raised a hand for silence. He looked at Margaret with new interest. That is a serious accusation, Mrs. Prescott. Can you substantiate it? Margaret nodded. She reached into her bag and pulled out a slim leather folder. The founding capital of $300,000, she said, came from the Holbrook Family Trust. My father's life insurance, which I inherited after his death. I can provide bank records, trust documents, and the original incorporation papers that show exactly where the money came from. She walked forward and placed the folder on the judge's bench. My husband did not build this company from nothing. He built it from my inheritance. And he has spent 25 years pretending otherwise. Judge Brennan opened the folder. His eyebrows rose as he reviewed the contents. This is, he said slowly, this is documentation going back 25 years. I have always kept records, Your Honor, Margaret said. It is a habit I learned from my father. Donovan was on his feet now, his face contorted with fury. This is a fabrication. She is lying. She has always been jealous of my success. Sit down, Mr. Prescott, Judge Brennan said quietly. He looked at Margaret. Is there anything else? Margaret met the judge's eyes. And in that moment, he saw something he had learned to recognize after 40 years on the bench. The quiet certainty of someone who had been preparing for this moment for a very long time. Yes, Your Honor, she said. There is much more. But I am only just getting started. The courtroom erupted into chaos. But Margaret stood perfectly still in the center of it all, calm as a stone in a stream. She had been silent for 25 years. Now, finally, she was ready to speak. And what she said next would destroy everything Donovan Prescott had ever built. The folder sat open on Judge Brennan's bench, its contents spreading across the polished wood like evidence at a crime scene. Which, in a sense, it was. Margaret stood in the center of the courtroom, her gray cardigan suddenly looking less like surrender and more like armor. The chaos around her seemed to exist at a distance, as if she had stepped into a bubble of absolute calm while the world outside it lost its mind. Harrison Webb was on his feet, shouting objections that Judge Brennan was not acknowledging. Donovan had gone pale, his hands gripping the edge of the petitioner's table so hard that his knuckles had turned white. In the gallery, Victoria Chen looked like a woman watching a building collapse and realizing she was still inside it. Only Claire Oduya seemed to understand what was happening. She sat very still at the respondent's table, her eyes fixed on her client with something approaching awe. Order, Judge Brennan said, and though he did not raise his voice, something in his tone cut through the noise like a blade. The courtroom fell silent. He looked at the documents before him, turning pages slowly, his expression unreadable. Mrs. Prescott, he said finally. These incorporation papers appear to show that the Holbrook Family Trust provided the founding capital for Prescott Capital. Is that correct? Yes, Your Honor. And you are the sole beneficiary of this trust? I am. The trust was established with my father's life insurance proceeds after his death in 1997. I used those funds to capitalize my husband's company in 1999. Judge Brennan made a note. He looked at Donovan. Mr. Prescott, you testified under oath that you built this company with your own savings. That your wife contributed nothing financially. Do you wish to revise that statement? Donovan's mouth opened and closed. For a man who had spent 3 decades charming rooms full of hostile investors, he suddenly seemed unable to form words. He started. The trust was, we were married by then. Marital assets are. You were not married when the company was founded, Margaret said quietly. We married in 2000. The company was incorporated in 1999. The capital came from my personal trust, which predated our relationship entirely. She turned to face the judge directly. I can provide the bank transfer records showing the movement of funds from the Holbrook Family Trust to the initial Prescott Capital operating account. I can provide the trust documents showing my sole beneficiary status. And I can provide testimony from the attorney who drafted both the trust and the original incorporation papers. She paused. My husband did not forget where the money came from, Your Honor. He simply stopped finding it convenient to remember. The silence in the courtroom was complete. Even the journalists in the gallery had stopped typing, their fingers frozen above their keyboards. Judge Brennan removed his reading glasses and rubbed his eyes. When he spoke again, his voice carried the weight of a man who had seen too many powerful people lie in his courtroom. Mr. Prescott, he said slowly, you have testified under oath regarding the source of your company's founding capital. If the documentation Mrs. Prescott has provided is authentic, that testimony constitutes perjury. Do you understand the implications of that? Donovan looked at Harrison Webb, desperate for rescue. But Webb had taken a subtle step backward, physically distancing himself from his client. Your Honor, Donovan said, his voice cracking slightly. This is a misunderstanding. The trust, my wife's money, it was all part of our shared resources. I did not mean to suggest. You stated, Judge Brennan interrupted, reading from his notes, that your wife brought nothing to the table financially. That you built this company from nothing. That every dollar came from your own hard work. Those were your exact words. Donovan said nothing. There was nothing to say. Margaret watched her husband with an expression that was almost gentle, almost pitying. She had waited 25 years for this moment, and now that it had arrived, she felt no triumph. Only a profound, exhausted relief. But she was not finished. Your Honor, she said, the founding capital is significant, but it is not the most important evidence I have to present. Judge Brennan raised an eyebrow. There is more. Margaret nodded. She returned to the respondent's table and retrieved a large cardboard box that had been sitting unopened throughout the 3 days of proceedings. Claire helped her carry it to the center of the courtroom. For 25 years, Margaret said, I have been the strategic architect of Prescott Capital. I identified the acquisition targets. I developed the restructuring plans. I wrote the analysis that underpinned every major decision this company has ever made. She opened the box. And I kept copies of everything. The documents inside were organized with meticulous precision. Folders labeled by year, by deal, by company. Hundreds of pages covered in Margaret's neat handwriting, each one dated, each one telling a piece of the story that had been erased from public memory. She pulled out the first folder. The Henderson Manufacturing Acquisition, 2003. This was the deal that established Prescott Capital as a major player in the corporate acquisition space. My husband has described it in numerous interviews as his breakthrough moment, the deal where he first demonstrated his unique vision for identifying undervalued companies. She opened the folder and removed a document. This is my analysis of Henderson Manufacturing, dated March 15, 2003. It identifies the company as a target, outlines the strategic rationale for acquisition, and details the restructuring plan that would eventually triple its value. She looked at Donovan. The public announcement of the Henderson acquisition was made on May 1, 2003. 6 weeks after I wrote this analysis. An analysis that my husband presented to the board as his own work. Donovan shook his head, but the gesture was weak, unconvincing. She could have written that after the fact. He said. She could have backdated. The documents have been authenticated, Margaret said calmly. I had them examined by a forensic document specialist before these proceedings began. The paper stock, the ink composition, the dating is accurate. She pulled out another folder. The Meridian Logistics Acquisition, 2007. The Coastal Energy Restructuring, 2010. The Pacific Media Group Takeover, 2015. She spread the folders across the table, one after another after another. Every major deal. Every strategic decision. Every moment of supposed brilliance that built my husband's reputation. I wrote the analysis. I developed the strategy. I did the work. She turned to face the gallery, and for the first time, her voice carried an edge of emotion. And then I watched him take credit for all of it. For 25 years. While he told the world that I contributed nothing. The journalists were typing furiously now. This was no longer just a billionaire divorce. This was the unraveling of a legend. Judge Brennan examined several of the documents, his expression growing darker with each page he reviewed. "Mrs. Prescott," he said finally, "if these documents are authentic, they suggest a pattern of deliberate misrepresentation extending over decades. They are authentic, Your Honor. And I have witnesses who can corroborate my involvement." "What witnesses?" Margaret looked toward the gallery. There, in the back row, sat a woman in her 50s with graying hair and nervous eyes. A woman who had worked as Donovan's executive assistant for 15 years before being quietly pushed out when she asked too many questions. "Helen Marchetti," Margaret said. She was present for most of the meetings where my analysis was discussed. She saw the documents in my handwriting. She watched my husband present my work as his own. Helen stood slowly, her hands trembling slightly. She walked forward until she reached the bar separating the gallery from the well of the court. "Mrs. Marchetti," Judge Brennan said, "are you prepared to testify regarding these matters?" Helen looked at Donovan, her former boss, the man who had fired her with a generous severance package and a confidentiality agreement that she had just decided to violate. "Yes, Your Honor," she said quietly. "I have kept silent for too long." What followed was the systematic dismantling of Donovan Prescott's carefully constructed mythology. Helen Marchetti testified for 45 minutes. She described meetings where Margaret's analysis was presented without attribution. She recalled conversations where Donovan explicitly instructed staff to remove Margaret's name from documents before they were distributed to the board. She produced emails, saved on a personal drive for years, showing Donovan taking credit for strategies that had originated with his wife. "I always thought it was wrong," Helen said, her voice growing stronger as she spoke. "But he was so powerful. And she never complained. I thought maybe I was misunderstanding the situation." She looked at Margaret with something like shame. "I should have said something sooner. I am sorry." Margaret shook her head gently. "You are saying something now. That is what matters." "I am not arresting you," Judge Brennan said calmly. "I am holding you in contempt for making threats and disrupting these proceedings. You will spend the night in custody while the court determines next steps." Donovan's eyes went wide with genuine panic. This was not supposed to happen. He was Donovan Prescott. He had lawyers, connections, friends in high places. He was not supposed to be led away in handcuffs like a common criminal. "Maggie," he said, turning to his wife with sudden desperation. "Maggie, please. Tell them this is a misunderstanding. We can work this out. Think about the company. Think about our family." Margaret looked at the man she had loved for 25 years. The man she had funded, trained, supported, and believed in. The man who had repaid her with erasure and contempt and the destruction of her relationship with their daughter. "I am thinking about our family," she said quietly. "For the first time in decades, I am finally putting our family first." She turned away. The last image Donovan Prescott saw as he was led from the courtroom was his wife's back, straight and unbowed, as she walked toward the daughter who had appeared in the gallery doorway. Rachel had come. She had been watching from the back of the courtroom throughout her mother's testimony. Now she stepped forward, tears streaming down her face, and embraced the woman who had waited so long to tell the truth. The journalists captured the moment. Mother and daughter, reunited. The silent partner, finally speaking. The mythology, finally destroyed. It would be the image on the front page of every business publication the next morning. And it would be the beginning of Donovan Prescott's end. The weeks that followed the courtroom revelation were a masterclass in collapse. Donovan was released from overnight custody, but the freedom was temporary and bitter. The state's attorney had opened an investigation into perjury charges. The SEC had launched an inquiry into potential securities fraud related to the offshore accounts. And the IRS was suddenly very interested in discrepancies between the company's reported holdings and its actual financial position. But the most devastating blow came from within his own empire. Donovan returned to his penthouse apartment 3 days after the courtroom disaster. The building's doorman, who had always greeted him with deference, barely made eye contact. The elevator operator said nothing during the long ride to the 58th floor. The apartment was silent when he entered. The lights were off. The air had the stale quality of a space that had been uninhabited. "Victoria," he called out, his voice echoing through the vast living room. "Victoria, I am home." No response. He walked through the apartment, turning on lights as he went. The kitchen was empty. The bedroom was empty. The bathroom was stripped of Victoria's products, her cosmetics, her endless collection of hair devices. The closet told the story. Her side was bare. Empty hangers swayed slightly in the climate-controlled air, as if her departure had been recent enough to leave traces of movement. On the bed, he found a note. The handwriting was Victoria's elegant script, the product of expensive schooling and careful cultivation. "Donovan, I watched the courtroom footage. Everyone has. You are not the man you told me you were. The SEC contacted me this morning. They want to know about Phoenix Holdings and the Singapore accounts. I told them I would cooperate fully. I have to think about my future. You should think about yours. Do not look for me. Victoria." Donovan read the note 3 times. Then he crumpled it in his fist and threw it across the room. "Traitor," he screamed to the empty apartment. "Useless, gold-digging traitor." But even as the words left his mouth, he knew they were hollow. Victoria had done exactly what he would have done in her position. She had calculated her odds and chosen survival. He had taught her well. The next blow came the following morning. Donovan sat at his home office computer, trying to access the Prescott Capital servers. He needed to see what was happening with the company. He needed to get ahead of whatever narratives were forming. He typed his password. The screen flashed red. Access denied. He tried again, more carefully this time. The same result. He picked up his phone and called the IT department. After 3 rings, a nervous voice answered. "Mr. Prescott," the voice said. His name was Kevin. He had been with the company for 8 years. "I was not expecting your call. Why am I locked out of the system, Kevin?" There was a long pause. "Too long. Your credentials were revoked, sir. Yesterday afternoon." "Revoked?" Donovan's voice rose. "By whom?" "I am the CEO of this company." Another pause. "By the acting board chair, sir. There was an emergency meeting yesterday morning. The board voted to suspend your access pending the outcome of the legal proceedings." Acting board chair? Donovan felt the floor shifting beneath him. Who is the acting board chair? Kevin's voice was barely a whisper. "Mrs. Prescott, sir. Margaret Prescott." The phone slipped from Donovan's hand. It clattered against the hardwood floor, but he made no move to retrieve it. Margaret. Acting board chair. Of his company. He scrambled to his filing cabinet, yanking open drawers, searching for the incorporation documents he had signed decades ago and never looked at again. He found them in a folder near the back, yellowed with age, covered in dust. He read them for the first time in 25 years. The Holbrook Family Trust, as founding capital provider, shall retain the following rights in perpetuity unless explicitly dissolved by written agreement of both the trust beneficiary and the company's board of directors. He kept reading. The words blurred together, but certain phrases jumped out at him. Right to appoint board representation. Right to approve major structural changes. Right to vote on executive compensation. He had never dissolved these rights. He had never even acknowledged they existed. He had signed amendments and restructuring documents for years, but none of them had addressed the original trust provisions. Because he had forgotten they existed. Because he had told himself the story of building something from nothing so many times that he had believed it. Because Margaret had handled all the paperwork in the early years, and he had never thought to question what she had put in place. She had been protecting herself from the very beginning. And now, combined with whatever share of the company she would receive in the divorce settlement, she controlled everything. He had been outmaneuvered. Not in the courtroom. Not in the past 3 days or even the past 3 years. He had been outmaneuvered 25 years ago, on the day he signed incorporation papers without reading them. The phone on his desk rang. His landline. Only a handful of people had that number. He picked it up slowly. "Hello, Donovan." Her voice was calm, almost gentle. There was no triumph in it, no gloating. Just the quiet confidence of someone who had finally stopped waiting. "Maggie," he said. His voice cracked on the word. "How did you do this?" "I did not do anything to you, Donovan. I simply documented the truth. You did the rest yourself." He gripped the phone tighter. "The company. You cannot just take my company. It was never just your company. That is the point you seem unable to grasp. I funded it. I built its strategy. I identified its opportunities. You were the face. You were the charm. But the substance, the actual mechanics of what we created, that came from both of us." She paused. "You spent 25 years pretending I did not exist, erasing my contributions, telling yourself and everyone else that you were a self-made genius. And I let you because I thought that was what partnership meant. I thought if I was patient enough, you would eventually remember the truth." Her voice hardened slightly. "But you did not remember. You convinced yourself that the lie was real. And then you started treating me like the lie was real. And then you treated our daughter like she was worthless because she reminded you of me." Donovan wanted to argue, but the words would not come. Everything she was saying was true. He knew it was true. He had known it for years, somewhere beneath the mythology he had constructed. "I am not taking your company," Margaret continued. "I am taking responsibility for what I built. There is a difference. What happens now? The board meets tomorrow morning. You will be formally removed as CEO. I will assume leadership on an interim basis while we restructure. And then, Margaret said, "I will do what I have always done. I will identify the opportunities. I will develop the strategies. I will make the decisions that create value." She paused. "The only difference is that this time everyone will know who is actually doing the work." "You will destroy everything," Donovan said. His voice was pleading now. "The company, our legacy, everything we built. I will not destroy anything. I will rebuild it on a foundation of truth instead of lies. That is what I have always been better at than you. Seeing what is actually there instead of what I want to see." "I will fight you," Donovan said, grasping for something resembling his former defiance. "I have lawyers. Resources. I will take this to court." "You can try," Margaret said simply. "But I would advise against it. You are already facing perjury charges. The SEC investigation is expanding. And I have 25 years of documentation showing exactly how this company was really built." She let that sink in. "Every time you go to court, more truth will come out. Every time you tell your version of the story, I will be there with the evidence that contradicts it. You can spend the rest of your life fighting, Donovan, but you will lose. Not because I am vindictive. Because I am right." The line was silent for a long moment. "Why now?" Donovan asked finally. His voice had lost its edge. He sounded old, tired, defeated. "Why did you wait so long?" "Because I loved you," Margaret said. "For a long time, I genuinely loved you. I believed that somewhere inside, the man I married still existed. The man who was grateful for our partnership. The man who saw me as an equal." She exhaled slowly. "But that man disappeared years ago. Maybe he was never really there. And when you put your hands on our daughter, when you told her she would never amount to anything, I realized that waiting had become the same thing as enabling. I could not let you hurt anyone else. I never meant to," Donovan started. "I know," Margaret interrupted. "That is almost the worst part. You did not mean to become what you became. You just stopped paying attention to who you were hurting. You stopped seeing us as people and started seeing us as props in your story. She paused. I am not a prop, Donovan. I never was. And now everyone knows it. The line went dead. Donovan sat alone in his empty apartment, the phone still pressed to his ear, listening to the silence where his wife's voice had been. For the first time in his adult life, he had nothing to say. The board meeting the following morning was brief and brutal. Margaret arrived at Prescott Capital headquarters at 8:45, 15 minutes before the scheduled start time. She wore a tailored black suit that she had bought the week before, the first expensive clothing she had purchased in years. Her hair was styled professionally. Her posture was straight and confident. She looked like what she had always been, a woman who belonged in that building. The board members were already assembled in the conference room. 12 men and women who had, until recently, considered themselves loyal to Donovan Prescott. Now they avoided eye contact with each other, shifting uncomfortably in their leather chairs. Margaret took her seat at the head of the table. Donovan's seat. Her seat. Thank you all for coming, she said. Her voice was calm and professional, with no trace of vindictiveness. I know the past week has been difficult. I know many of you are uncertain about the future of this company. I am here to provide clarity. She opened a folder containing documents she had prepared. First, the legal situation. Donovan faces multiple investigations that will likely result in criminal charges. His ability to serve in any leadership capacity is effectively over. The board must move forward without him. She looked around the table, meeting each pair of eyes in turn. Second, the company itself remains fundamentally sound. Our portfolio companies are profitable. Our investor relationships are stable. The only thing that has collapsed is the mythology around its founder. She paused. Some of you knew the truth about who really built this company. Some of you suspected. Some of you had no idea. I am not here to assign blame or demand apologies. I am here to lead. A board member named Thomas Park, one of the longest tenured members, cleared his throat. Mrs. Prescott, he said carefully. Given the circumstances, some of us have concerns about the optics. A leadership transition in the middle of multiple investigations. The investigations are about Donovan's conduct, Margaret interrupted. Not the company's operations. Our portfolio companies are performing well. Our fundamentals are strong. What we need is stability and transparency. I can provide both. She leaned forward. I have been doing the strategic work of this company for 25 years. The only difference now is that everyone will know it. I understand if some of you are uncomfortable with that. If you wish to resign from the board, I will accept your resignation without prejudice. She waited. No one moved. Then I call for a vote, she said. The motion is to remove Donovan Prescott as CEO and appoint me as interim chief executive pending a permanent leadership review. All in favor. Hands rose around the table. One by one, then all at once. 12 votes in favor. None opposed. The motion carries, Margaret said. She felt something shift in her chest. Not triumph. Something quieter. Something like finally. She stood. The company will be renamed Holbrook Capital, effective next month. I have already begun the rebranding process. Our first priority will be transparency. Our investors will receive detailed documentation of our strategic history. They will understand that the foundation of this company was always solid, even when the face of it was not. She looked around the table one final time. I am not my ex-husband, she said. I do not need flattery or adulation. I need competence, honesty, and commitment. If you can provide those things, we will work well together. If you cannot, there is the door. No one moved toward the door. Then we are done here, Margaret said. I will see you all at the quarterly review next week. She left the conference room without looking back. Behind her, the board members sat in stunned silence, trying to reconcile the quiet woman they had dismissed for decades with the leader who had just taken control of a $2 billion company. They were not the only ones adjusting their understanding. The legal proceedings that followed were lengthy but ultimately anticlimactic. Donovan Prescott faced 3 separate investigations. The perjury charges stemming from his courtroom testimony were the most straightforward. He had lied under oath about the source of his company's founding capital, and the documentation proving his lies was irrefutable. The SEC investigation into securities fraud took longer but was equally damning. Years of financial maneuvering had created a web of offshore accounts and shell companies designed to hide assets from investors, regulators, and his wife. Victoria Chen's testimony, provided in exchange for immunity, filled in the gaps that the documentation could not. The IRS investigation added tax evasion to his growing list of problems. In the end, Donovan's attorneys negotiated a plea agreement. 3 years in federal prison, with eligibility for parole after 18 months. Forfeiture of hidden assets totaling approximately $47 million. A lifetime ban from serving as an officer or director of any publicly traded company. The man who had once graced the covers of business magazines was photographed being escorted into the Federal Correctional Institution in Danbury, Connecticut. He wore a gray jumpsuit instead of a custom suit. His silver hair had gone unkempt. His famous confidence had vanished. No one came to see him off. Not Victoria, who had relocated to London. Not the board members who had once competed for his approval. Not the investors who had celebrated his supposed genius. And not Margaret, who was too busy running the company he had claimed to build. 1 year after the courtroom revelation, Margaret stood at a podium in the grand ballroom of the Ritz-Carlton. The occasion was the launch of the Holbrook Foundation for Economic Education, a non-profit focused on teaching financial literacy to underserved communities. The room was filled with business leaders, philanthropists, and journalists. Many of them had once been Donovan's friends and admirers. Now they were here to celebrate the woman he had tried to erase. Margaret wore a deep blue dress that complemented her silver-streaked hair. She looked comfortable, confident, at home. "Thank you all for coming," she said, her voice carrying easily across the silent room. "A year ago, I sat in a courtroom watching my husband of 25 years systematically lie about our life together. He told the judge, the press, and the world that I had contributed nothing. That I was worthless. That I was nothing." She paused, letting the words settle. I could have responded with anger. I could have interrupted, shouted, demanded to be heard. But I had learned something over those 25 years. I had learned that the loudest voice in the room is not always the strongest. That patience is not the same as weakness. That sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is wait for the right moment to speak. She looked out at the audience. When that moment came, I was ready. Not because I had planned some elaborate revenge, but because I had done something very simple. I had documented the truth. I had kept records. I had preserved evidence. And when the lies finally became too big to ignore, the truth was there waiting. She gestured to a screen behind her, where images appeared showing the Foundation's planned programs. The Holbrook Foundation exists because I believe that knowledge is power. Not knowledge that is hoarded or hidden, but knowledge that is shared freely. We will teach young people how to understand financial documents, how to recognize exploitation, how to protect themselves from those who would take advantage of their trust. She smiled slightly. We will teach them to pay attention, to take notes, to keep records. Because sometimes the most important thing you can do is remember what actually happened. The applause was genuine and sustained. After the speech, Margaret made her way through the crowd, accepting congratulations and answering questions. She was not used to being the center of attention, but she was learning to carry it with grace. Near the back of the ballroom, she spotted a familiar face. Thomas Brenner was 61 years old, a widowed architect who had designed the new Holbrook Capital headquarters. They had been introduced 6 months earlier, and what had begun as a professional relationship had gradually evolved into something more. He was a quiet man who listened more than he spoke. He asked questions about her work and actually cared about the answers. He treated her like an equal, not a prop. "That was quite a speech," he said, handing her a glass of sparkling water. "Thank you. I was terrified." "You did not look terrified. You looked like you belonged up there." Margaret considered this. For so long, she had believed that belonging meant being invisible. That her place was in the background, supporting someone else's vision. It had taken 25 years and a courtroom confrontation to teach her otherwise. "I am still getting used to it," she admitted. "Being seen." Thomas nodded. "It takes time. But you are doing beautifully." They stood together in comfortable silence, watching the crowd mingle. "I received a letter yesterday," Margaret said finally. "From Donovan." Thomas raised an eyebrow. "What did it say?" "He wants me to visit him. He says he has had time to think. He says he understands now what he did wrong." Margaret took a sip of her water. "He says he forgives me." Thomas was silent for a moment. Then he let out a short laugh. "He forgives you?" Margaret smiled slightly. "That was my reaction as well." "Will you go?" She considered the question carefully. "No," she said finally. "I spent 25 years waiting for him to see me. Waiting for him to acknowledge what I contributed. Waiting for him to become the man I thought I married." She shook her head. "I am done waiting. Whatever understanding he has reached, he will have to live with it on his own. I have a company to run, a foundation to build, a life to live." She looked at Thomas, and something warm passed between them. "I have waited long enough," she said. "Now I am moving forward." The story does not end with a dramatic confrontation. It does not end with Margaret standing over her defeated ex-husband, delivering a triumphant monologue. Real life rarely provides such clean conclusions. Instead, it ends quietly. Margaret sits in her office at Holbrook Capital, reviewing documents as the sun sets over the city. The view from her window is spectacular, but she rarely looks at it. She is too focused on the work, as she has always been. Her phone buzzes. A text from Rachel. "Finished editing the documentary. Want to see the rough cut this weekend?" Margaret smiles. Rachel's documentary about women whose contributions were erased from history has become something else entirely. It has become a portrait of her mother, a record of resilience, a testimony to the power of patience. She types her response. "I would love that. Dinner Saturday." The response comes immediately. "Already made reservations. Love you, Mom." Margaret sets down her phone and looks out the window for the first time in hours. The city is beautiful in the fading light. All those buildings, all those stories, all those lives being lived in ways she will never know. She thinks about Donovan, alone in his cell, writing letters she will not read. She thinks about Victoria, rebuilding a career in London, pretending the past never happened. She thinks about all the people who believed the mythology, who accepted the lie, who never thought to question the story they were being told. And she thinks about herself. The woman who waited 25 years to speak. The woman who documented everything, remembered everything, prepared for the moment that finally came. She had been silent for so long. People thought it meant she had nothing to say. They were wrong. The intercom buzzes. Her assistant's voice comes through. "Mrs. Holbrook, your 7 o'clock is here." "Thank you," Margaret says. "Send them in." She stands, straightening her jacket, preparing for the next meeting, the next decision, the next step forward. The world thought she was weak because she did not shout. They thought she was powerless because she did not fight. They thought she was nothing because she let them believe it. They were all wrong. Margaret Holbrook proved that the most dangerous person in the room is not always the one making the most noise. Sometimes it is the quiet one in the corner, watching everything, remembering everything, waiting for the perfect moment to reveal what she has always known. Patience is not weakness. Silence is not surrender. And the truth, documented and preserved, will always outlast the lies. If this story touched you, please take a moment to like and subscribe. Share it with someone who needs to hear that their silence does not mean they are powerless. And remember, the next time you encounter someone who seems quiet, who seems overlooked, who seems like nothing at all, they might just be taking notes.